And today we're gathered to hear from Professor Robert G. Crawford, Associate Professor of Business Management at the Marriott School at Brigham Young University. The topic of his lecture is Entrepreneurship as Ethics, Implications for Policy. Professor Crawford's focus on economics and ethics led him to specialize in economic obsolescence, special purpose property value, self and self-interest, and valuation theory. The author of various publications, Crawford's recent works include Appraising Industrial Special Purpose Property and Unsettling the Metaphysics of Neoclassical Microeconomic and Management Thinking. He earned his bachelor's degree at BYU before pursuing his studies at Carnegie Mellon University, where he earned his master's and doctoral degrees in economics. In 1972, Professor Crawford began his teaching career as an assistant professor at BYU. Following a one-year visiting research fellow position at UCLA, he returned to BYU. From 1984 to 1990, Crawford served as the chair of BYU's Managerial Economics Department. During a portion of this appointment, he also worked as the acting director of the Smith Center for Free Enterprise Studies at BYU. Born in Canada, Crawford holds dual citizenship there and the U.S. So on behalf of the Kennedy Center, and I should probably add our Canadian Studies Research Program, we welcome Professor Crawford.
Thank you very much. I'm going to stand on this side, I think, to keep out of the way of the spotlight and the screen. I'm delighted to be here. I've worried a lot about offering. I came to hear Elder John Harris talk before he left to go to Brazil. And at lunch, I was asked about my research and got talking, and I was asked if I would like to give a talk. And so I agreed to, and then I was wishing in some instances I hadn't, because I became concerned that a minor problem that you might not understand what I'm talking about, but a major problem is that I might not know what I'm talking about. And so as a good economist, I'm going to assume that I know what I'm talking about, and I hope that at the end you will have an idea of what I am talking about. A good speaker should be like a candle at a birthday party. Stand up straight. Don't drip on the cake. Shed a little light on the subject, and don't last too long. So if I can be like a candle, I will be successful. I would like to begin by expressing some fear over listening to an economist talk. A few years ago, Brezhnev was standing out viewing the May Day parade, and as he was watching the parade, he turned to his aide and he says, "Comrade, who are these men walking in front of the nuclear missiles?" And his aide said, "Sir, those men are economists." And Brezhnev turned to his aide and said, "Comrade, why do we have economists walking in front of the nuclear missiles?" And his aide said, "Sir, you'll be amazed at the damage they can do." So I worry about that too. I've changed my topic a little bit: economics, ethics, and public policy, implications of self and self-interest. I'm going to use 5 concepts that are sort of embedded in what I want to say. Without much justification, I will use these words. I'm thinking of the ego as the active profile of the self, its personal enjoyment, and an indifference to others. The ego privileges itself over others. I think of the term worth as the relationship that persons have to things. We give worth to things, and we value things, and ethics is the relation of person to person. So the ethical relation is the interpersonal relationship. I think this is important because in market exchange, it is always an interpersonal activity. So market exchange is an ethical behavior. It's in the ethical domain. I'm going to use the term obligation as that which is created in me by the presence of the other person. The other person obligates me. This is from a certain philosophical perspective which I think has some merit. And I'm going to say that this obligation is not a choice. morality, the way in which we take up our obligation to others, is a choice. The modern self, we characterize it in modern economics at least, and in modern social science, is a reduction to the ego. The modern self is the ego, and self-interest is basically characterized as ego interest. It's about my enjoyment, independent or indifferent to others. So I think of the term selfishness as meaning ego interest. The modern self is, I characterize, a deficit self, a caricature of the self. If we think of we might say rational economic man, for want of a better term, that's a caricature of what it means to be a person. If we look at a definition of self-interest, this comes from a paper written by Richard Epstein, who's a legal scholar at the University of Chicago and friendly towards economics. He defines self-interest as an attitude, disposition, or approach that persons bring toward their initial endowments. It states that they will use these endowments so as to maximize their private returns, subject to whatever external constraints, natural, social, or legal, under which they labor. Self-interest is the universal function which transforms natural endowments, the argument of the function, into individual satisfactions, the dependent variable. The organisms that are self-regarding, and I add egoist in this context, keep all of what they produce and are able to obtain some fraction of the output of other organisms whose altruism is genuine and powerful. And then this is Epstein's phrase: in time, genuine altruists lose market share to committed egoists. The process is in a sense inexorable, so that altruists in the long run face extinction. The battle over resources is a function of scarcity, not of the particulars of any physical or social arrangements. And he goes on to explicate this idea more. And I think that is way overstepping what really we mean by it. And I'm going to try and use the Ethiopian famine crisis as a means of, as a metaphor for carrying my idea. What I consider in opposition to the modern self or the caricature of a self, I consider a complete self. A complete self is an amalgam of an affect, the passive profile of a self, it's an openness to others, the openness to be affected by others, and ego, the active enjoying profile of the self. So for me, I would like to say that the self has an ego, but can't be reduced to ego. That there is a broader perspective. We can think of the self in some sense as an activity, a consequence of a social construction. Whereas the deficit self is ego-dominated. And I want to say that today's world is basically the creation of ego-dominated selves. And I'll use this Ethiopian famine crisis as a means of talking about this. This is a map of the area I'm referring to. You see in white the Nile River moving down from Ethiopia. About apparently 85% of the headwaters of the Nile originate in Ethiopia, and you can see the Aswan Dam that's doesn't work anyway, so we'll try it. The pointer. This is an Ethiopian farmer who lives on the Rib River near the data that I'm using is out of the Wall Street Journal from last November and December. There's 2 or 3 articles on this affair. The Blue Nile is a tributary. In good times, the farmer gets 1 crop per year, but his 1-acre field floods when the rains are good and the river rampages. When the rains fail, his crops wither while the river meanders by. There are no dams to regulate the flow and no canals or pumps to drain the fields during the flood. So this is a typical Ethiopian farmer. Meanwhile, an Egyptian farmer mentioned in the article, 45, tends 200 acres on the far edge of the Nile Delta. But thanks to a network of canals and pumping stations financed by U.S. aid, his land is alive with apples, grapes, apricots, cucumbers, peppers, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cherry tomatoes, and eggplant. Plus he runs 600 head of cattle, which he keeps cool in the summer by a misting device that sprays water like you would get out on the sidewalks of Phoenix outside of big department stores. They keep his cattle cool. America supplies food aid and grain to Ethiopia while Ethiopian grain sits undistributed. Germain Amante, a farmer in the highlands, owns a warehouse with hundreds of bags marked with the Ethiopian flag holding surplus grain that he has grown and others have. They're grown in the fertile highlands that have defied the drought. Simultaneously outside his warehouse on a narrow black road, truck after truck carrying red, white, and blue bags from America carry grain from Djibouti to consumers in Ethiopia. There's an ambivalence about this. Amante says the farmers are we're appreciative of the aid, but sad and discouraged that the U.S. government buys surplus grain from America, required by law, and ships it to Ethiopia instead of first buying Ethiopian produce. He estimates that at least 100,000 metric tons of corn, wheat, and sorghum are available to local consumers after they have been supplied by American food aid. Some of it has sat for 8 months. He says Ethiopia has no funds to buy its own farmers' grain and redistribute it. 2 weeks ago, this was sometime in November, the Ethiopian farmers and grain traders sent a petition to the Prime Minister's office urging the government to seek money from donor nations to allow local grain to be purchased for food aid before bringing more in from the outside. The petitioners warned that if warehouses aren't cleared out soon, there won't be money to pay for the harvest nor space to store it. Domestic prices will collapse, loans go unpaid, and farmers will plant less the next year, and the cycle of famine will continue. So this is the situation in Ethiopia. As the Ethiopian were drafting their initiative, a group of American farmers were sending a letter to the Bush administration urging more food aid exports. They want Washington to begin donating a minimum of 3 million metric tons of wheat a year in food aid around the world, up from the 2.2 million metric tons the government bought from the U.S. farmers in the year ending on my birthday, May 31st. We believe that the U.S. government should keep the food in food aid, the letter said. Jim Evans is a local Washington farmer. He said, quote, "We need food aid," and I put in my own world poverty, "to get rid of our excess commodities. American farmers produce twice as much wheat as the country needs. Federal subsidy checks protect them from unprofitable prices, and Washington buys much of their wheat for shipment to Ethiopia and other poor countries." Mr. Evans estimated that about a third of his $200,000 gross income from wheat and lentils and such comes from doing aid with food aid programs. And there's a great pyramid of agencies and jobs, shipping containers, ports, ships, railroad. There's just a great web of jobs that are dependent on this transportation of grain from America to the rest of the world. The author of the article asked an Ethiopian farmer, Hamid, what would happen if the Ethiopians could take water out of the Nile like he does. He says, "I'm sure it would affect the amount of water we can use. Without the Nile water, I can't plant or raise cattle." We have this structure. The Ethiopian farmers don't have any technology that helps them use the water that is 85% from their country. The Egyptians don't want to have anybody diminish the amount of Nile water that gets to them because that would reduce their capacity to farm. And the American farmers want to keep food in food aid because if we don't have the food aid, then the surpluses will build up and that will put pressure on the farm policies in the United States. I'm sort of summarizing an economic principle here. It's unique or specialized assets that capture the capitalized value of the expectations in the system. So asset values are basically determined by a given set of expectations. If the world plays out like you expect, asset values don't change. It's only these uncertain or surprises that cause asset values to change. There is a tremendous number of property values and jobs that characterize the wealth of what I would characterize as ego interest. And in the political process, politicians try to upset only the smallest apple cart. It's very difficult to make any policy that doesn't offend somebody. So the policy is to offend the fewest. And so this egoism that we see in the modern world is the traditional self-interest, and it's an immense hurdle for anybody to overcome. I'm going to step back now and look at something that undergirds the complete self that I'm talking about. I'm talking about complete self-interest here. From a philosopher named Emmanuel Levinas, I get the definition of ethics. Ethics names the calling into question of egoist spontaneity by the presence of the other person. And we experience that calling into question as obligation. Now, if you hear this for the first time, I'm sure it's going to sound very strange, but take it on its face. The presence of the other person obligates me. That's not a choice. The way I teach this to my class on ethics is I read this and then I in other language talk about the parable of the Good Samaritan. A man goes to Jericho, falls among thieves, is stripped, wounded, laying by the side of the road. He's just there, and along comes a priest, a Levite, and a Samaritan. All three of them are obligated by that other there. And the priest and the Levite pass by on the other side. They refuse their obligation. The Samaritan takes it up. So I want to say that the obligation is not a choice. How we react to it is a choice. The presence of the other person obligates me to meet even their material needs. The other's hunger is sacred. Only the hunger of a third party limits its rights. This is a quote from a book by Levinas named Difficult Liberty. So the summary of this is that obligation is not a choice. In my obligation to one, there's always a third to whom I am also obligated, and that likewise is not a choice. My choice is adjudicating between the competing obligations that I face. Morality names the way in which we do this, or we accomplish this adjudication. Morality and ethics are not the same. Ethics is the ground of morality. How does this relate to the economy? I think we all recognize for us to make a place for ourselves, i.e. to fulfill our obligation, we have to be of service to others. All of you here in school are here getting an education, in a sense, increasing your capacity to be of service. On our campus entrance we say, enter to learn, go forth to serve. The question is, how best to serve? Who is the best to serve? How shall we serve them, and what shall we serve them? From the theory of competitive markets, I'm taking this from the theoretical perspective, price directs the service that one must give. The one with the highest price is the one most in need of service. The competitive market is the most effective social institution for accomplishing the revealing of who is most desirable or who is in most need of service, and that is accomplished by prices and profit. Since economic profit measures the net value of everyone's claim, responding to profit signal takes into account the fact that service could be to others. Economic profit signals the relative strength of everyone's claim, thereby signaling whom to serve. In a sense, expected profit is a summons to serve. Economic profit is determined by others' valuation of the service. We could think of it as a moral command, or we could, if we're school in economics, think of it as Adam Smith's invisible hand. Profit signals whether or not the service is acceptable to the particular one being served. Profit is not a direct pursuit, but is an after-the-fact warrant that the service has met the requirements of the served. Profit is not pursued. It is not the object of pursuit. Profit ensues from pursuing proper service. So it's a follow-on. So this theoretical assumption works only if we have two underlying assumptions. These are implicit assumptions that are not often made explicit. The first one is that everyone is equally prepared to participate in the market. If that's the case, and if all preferences are equally worthy, or all demands are equally worthy of satisfaction, those two underlying assumptions allow all the efficiency claims and the claims of value that economic theory would want to make about competitive markets. But in life, neither of those hold. Not everyone is equally prepared to play, and not all wants are equally worthy of satisfaction. And there's no economic ground, essentially, for discriminating across the worthiness of wants. So I talk about this in the sense that those who are not prepared to participate, equally prepared, require some aid in the interim while they are being prepared to participate. The kind of aid, essentially, really reveals the soul of the society. So you think about the quality of the society, you can think about how the disadvantaged or the marginalized are aided. Let's go back to the Ethiopian crisis. The Ethiopian Minister of Water Resources said that rather than just give food handouts, we should give infrastructure. That would really, instead of giving someone a fish, we should teach them to fish. This year the U.S. gives us $500 million in food aid, and it's gone within 1 year. People get the food, but it never brings additional value to the country. There's no value added in essence. If this money goes to a power project or irrigation, it can keep on helping every year. But that would, in a sense, lessen the demand for food aid, and that would put great pressure on the economic agricultural system and policy that currently is in the United States. From discovery of the situation, the Ethiopians were feared to be building dams secretly, so they invited various groups to come and take a look. The engineers have concluded that Ethiopian dams could produce enough energy not only to supply Ethiopian demand for electricity, but feed Egypt's power grid and all the way to Europe. Egypt now has, from the Aswan Dam, a huge power generating capacity. They supply Egypt, but they're able to export a substantial amount to Europe. There's problems with the Aswan Dam, though. Part of it is that the denuded lands in Ethiopia mean that there's a tremendous amount of silt that comes off in the runoff, and that's slowly filling up the Aswan Dam. And it soon will not have the capacity to either generate power or contain water that it currently has. Engineers agree that storing water in Ethiopia's deep natural gorges would lose far less water to evaporation than the Aswan Dam in the hot, arid Egyptian desert. In fact, they calculate that the amount of water used in Ethiopia would be less than the evaporation in Aswan. So there would be no net water loss to Egypt if you put the dams in Ethiopia rather than in Egypt. You would then get irrigation and power generation for Ethiopia, which would be a great advantage to them without really reducing the power available and the water available to Egypt. So if you think of another characterization of the self, if you think of the egoist self, being for me is, in essence, being against you. There's competing egos. Or if you think of a self of being for others is as being for me. And I think I claim that this is very consistent with economic theory. It's a different interpretation, but the consequences of this interpretation are not, in essence, different on the market where people are prepared to play. So we think of it in this sense. There is enough water. It is a matter of managing it, says Egypt's Matawi. To look at the Nile from a selfish or egoist point of view will not help anyone. The Egyptians were really surprised when they visited Ethiopia. There weren't even any trees, says Wandikman, the Commissioner for Sustainable Agriculture and Environmental Rehabilitation in Ethiopia's Amhara region. The conclusion, he said, was clear. Unless we have watershed management in Ethiopia, the whole system will be hurt. The history of how Egypt has been privileged in the geopolitical realm comes a lot from the policies of keeping a stable country in the Middle East, and Egypt seemed to be the one that was most critical. So Egypt received a tremendous amount of aid, first when they were in the eastern camp from the Russians that helped them build the Aswan Dam, and now in the western camp they get the canals and aid for technological infrastructure development. But it's still in somebody else's. I'm only going to help you if I see that it helps me primarily first. And that has brought us, I contend, to the current situation we have in Ethiopia. What can we do for public policy? I claim that public policy must find a way to emulate the competition accomplished by market competition. Market competition is a way of making concrete the ethical claim. Market competition prevents me from acting any way I want in the marketplace. I have to respond to what the customer wants, even if I don't like it. And it turns out that with market competition, what is in your interest has to become my interest, otherwise I disappear. I am competed out. Competition does this by providing simultaneous options that question the spontaneity of any potential supplier. It's the simultaneous competitive options that work. Government gives us sequential options. We have competition for who can become the government in, say, in a democracy, but once we have the government, there are no options to that one until the next election. And it's the sequential options that seem to be inadequate and have resulted in the kind of policy structure we have in today's world. Let me summarize my conclusions on this then. Ethics calls one to be for the other, and that is, in a sense, the meaning of personal goodness. However, morality, the rules for answering the call to be for the other, does not flow from the well of personal goodness. Personal goodness is unreliable. I don't buy from a given company because they are, quote, personally good. I don't know. I don't even have to care, because I am assured that the competitive market will prevent them from doing things that would not be considered good. There are theoretical caveats we have to apply to that. I'm going to say that competition enhances the probability of answering the call to be for the other. What business firms actually do is they try and best satisfy the customer. They don't directly pursue profits. Profits ensue if they are successful in satisfying the customer compared with alternatives. So I want to say that competition enhances the probability of answering the call to be for the other, the ethical response. Competition emulating policy would thwart egoism. That's the brief version of my presentation. And I'll turn off the frame, and I was a good candle. I didn't last too long. We have approximately 20 to 25 minutes to take questions. I'll tell you a funny story. I went to China a few years ago to give some lectures on economics and management. And at Jiao Tong University in Shanghai, I was giving a lecture to about 150 faculty members and students. And I had a translator who was, I would say a phrase, and he would translate the phrase into Chinese. And I was standing there. These were not a very humorous bunch. I made a crack about the bad service I got at the restaurant earlier that day, and I said that I think Chairman Mao knows who I am and what I'm talking about, and he doesn't like it. Not a smile, nothing. So I thought, well, I better watch the jokes that I give. Anyway, I was saying to the audience, it's now time for questions. In Chinese, it's now time for questions. If you ask the questions in English, I will answer the questions. He's translating. And I said, if you ask the questions in Chinese, You have to ask questions in Chinese. I said, Mr. Zhou will answer the questions. And he says, Mr. Oh, he says, you joke me. So if you ask the questions in English, I will answer the questions. If you ask them in Chinese, Mr. Zhou, who's not here, will answer the questions. So let me field questions from you on the idea of ethics, economics, my claims for public policy, and any other thought that I've stimulated from you.
I have a question surrounding, egoism and altruism. There's sort of a fundamental assumption made that a human actor can make an accurate cost-benefit analysis in order to act in a self-interested way or in another interested way. But I think we can see from experience that human beings, because we are boundedly rational, we can't make those cost-benefit analysis accurate. How do we orient ourselves, I guess, philosophically when we're trying to make decisions in terms of self-interest or other interest or even systems?
Well, I think did everyone hear the question? The question is, given the limited rationality and we can't really make a calculated cost-benefit analysis to know what really is in our self-interest, how do we make decisions? I think it's right. One, I think it's very difficult to know what is in your self-interest and to make decisions. I think that's one of the functions of money in this society, and why money is such an important thing, is that money allows us to defer having to choose. Because it's store of value, even if I don't know quite yet what I want, I don't know how to calculate that, I know that if I'm working and accumulating income in the form of fungible money, that I can defer that choice. That's one of the real benefits of money. And so that enables me to be more contemplative. But I don't think we necessarily want to assume, that we're always making that calculation. If we think that every choice is made on a, quote, Benthamite calculus of some kind, a utilitarian calculus, then I think we're narrowing too much the choice process. That there is, in a sense, that assumes that we are an individual ego isolated or atomistic, isolated from others. But if I think of myself as being connected to others in an essential way, so that being for you is being for me, I don't make myself indifferent and autonomous or atomistic, then I have to worry about some measure of transcendence. There's got to be something just other than my own preferences that govern. It's clear that if we just let my own calculus, my own preferences govern, then I can greatly have a very negative effect on society. If there's nothing that calls into question my preferences. We see it with Idi Amin in Uganda, we saw it with Hitler, we saw it with Ceausescu in Romania. There's lots of despots who made the calculus of their own best interest, quote unquote, but there was nothing to call them into question. It's not that people can't be egoist. It's that if we don't have any mechanism to check that, then we're in a difficult situation. And we always have some, particularly in say, democratic societies, we have the rule of law, which is morality, that calls into question my calculus. I can say, okay, suppose I make that calculation, it's in my best interest to have somebody killed. I can make that calculus. A lot of people do, and they do it. That they do is sort of banal. That they ought not to is another matter. But if you don't have any check on that egoist calculus, you have no check on anything. Yes, your name?
Melissa.
Melissa?
You said the solution to public policy would be to apply market values.
No, not necessarily to apply market values. My claim, I think, is that we have to have some competitive option akin to what happens in a free market that is defining public policy. If you have if you have some competition. One of the things you see it in terms of the cities that used to provide, say, their own garbage collection. And it got to be problematic, and so they have now bidded out competitive bidding. And they have alternatives bid for the right to, say, do garbage collection, and then the city gets rid of the inclination to build the bureaucracy and make it more expensive and, in a sense, consume more resources in the management of the process than is warranted. So I think that for any kind of public policy, insofar as you can emulate the effects of competition, not always can you make it a market transaction. There are some things that just aren't amenable to that. But if you can somehow emulate the effect that simultaneous competition engenders, then you accomplish the goal. Is that?
Yeah, I was gonna say, well, how do you apply it, like, practically, like in the case study which you showed us?
How would I do this practically?
Like, I mean, how would you apply it? Like, you're talking about concepts, but.
Well, for the Ethiopian crisis, I think almost everyone running the program can see the problem. But the political costs of diminishing the amount of, say, price supports for agricultural surplus in the United States and then buying it and distributing it is a tough one. On margin, I think in this case we could do it because it takes a lot less to first buy the Ethiopian grain and get the market system there to be more self-sustaining, and then to, like in Egypt, give some infrastructure aid to develop the technology that smooths out the water flow, and that would solve their problem. So you're trying to mimic what would happen in a market. I'm a Canadian farm boy, and my father farmed dryland farm for all of his life. And when he sold his farm, it was a little rolly and it didn't work very well, and he had good years and bad years. But now almost all of the farmers in the southern Alberta where I grew up have center pivot sprinkling systems. My father, we had a big irrigation canal that went through our quarter section of land, but we got no water from it because we couldn't use it. It was just not level enough. Now they just pump out of the canal and they don't worry about rainfall. They worry about it over a long horizon if the reservoirs go dry. But that's the kind of specific application that I'm thinking of. Insofar as you can emulate a competitive bidding process, then you simultaneously then you accomplish this check on the egoism that governs almost all of the policy otherwise. Larry. I should comment, Larry is a former teacher of mine, although I look older than he does. It's disgusting that Wimmer never gets older. But well, it may be, but Larry has read a copy of my paper and has given me some very good comments, and I'm very appreciative of his insights.
But it seems to me that you're trying to sell us on a new paradigm, a new model, the complete self, obligated to third parties and so on. It will better help us understand, say, for example, the Ethiopian crisis.
I think it would.
I know that's bad, but okay, shorthand.
Oh, I understand.
The traditional economic model would say, yeah, we understand this. This is a problem of the common resource problem, water,
Mm-hmm.
and political power models, American agricultural self-interest,
Mm-hmm.
and Egyptian political self-interest.
Right.
So with those models, we can explain the problem. We can talk about what would have to change, what kind of incentives would have to be set up to lead to a more efficient and equitable solution. So in what sense does this new paradigm provide us with greater explanatory power or predictive power than the traditional model?
I think it gives a ground for making the change on the margin. I think for economists and the efficiency of markets, if all are prepared to play, we can see what's going to take place. And if you don't have everyone equally prepared to play, then you've got people on the margin, and you don't have a market system conceptually that takes care of that problem. I don't see. You have it on the side. You've got charitable organizations. There's some extra economic or extra market system that takes care of the wake of the economic system.
Or monopoly on the other side.
Yeah, and if you have monopoly on the other side, you run the same problem. We can clearly see the problem from the traditional economic model with monopoly, because monopoly then allows the potential for an egoist to just do what they want, and if you don't like it, tough. So we can see the argument for having competition to put in check. What I'm claiming is that we don't get enough of a recognition of the problem of the market system with this traditional set of assumptions. It works, and I'm in favor of it in a limited domain. I think there's a very good illustration of the problem we're talking about in yesterday's Deseret News. Walt Williams writes great articles, and he has written one on government, and he compares government to the possibility of deciding. He uses the government comparison to a referee at a basketball game. And the referee at the basketball game just should apply the rules equally across the game and should not in any sense determine who's a winner and who's a loser. And he says if we have that kind of government, we're going to get people going from the game. When their team loses, they go out maybe disgruntled, but they don't start trashing the place and burning. We have that equilibrium. He proposes government like that, but he also doesn't account for the fact that in the basketball game, we know that both teams are basically equally prepared to play, so that there's no need for the referee to determine the winner or loser, and there's no need for, say, a handicap. But if you took an NBA basketball team and a junior high school team and just applied the rules, you would see that, first of all, that would not attract an audience. Because
Egypt and Ethiopia.
yeah, they're not equally prepared to play. If they were equally prepared to play, then we would get a better result with the traditional model. But I think the traditional model is left with more general credit than it warrants because the implicit assumptions are not recognized. I hope everyone understood the question that Larry asked. He was far enough in the back. Yes?
How does your model deal with unethical industries, say the tobacco industry? The tobacco industry has no ethical values. They admit they create an addictive product, health impairing, death dealing, and yet they spend their billions to capture customers.
Okay, the question is, how do we deal with the unethical tobacco industries?